This episode of Serverless Chats is sponsored by Epsagon. This week, I chat with Sarjeel Yusuf about serverless in a DevOps world. This is Serverless Chats, episode number 89. Hi, everyone. I'm Jeremy Daly, and this is Serverless Chats. Today, I'm joined by Sarjeel Yusuf. Hey, Sarjeel, thanks for joining me.
Hey, Jeremy, thank you so much for having me. I just want to say it's pretty exciting to be here. I've been watching the show for quite a while now, and it's just exciting to be here with you and talk about everything serverless, I guess.
Well, I'm excited to have you here. So just to introduce yourself, so you are a product manager at Atlassian. So I'd love it if you could tell the listeners a little bit about your background and what you do at Atlassian.
Sure. So yeah, as you mentioned, I'm a product manager at Atlassian. Actually, a very new product manager. Just a year ago, I was a software developer, within Atlassian, within Opsgenie, and now I'm a product manager at Opsgenie. So I made the switch to product management very recently, actually. And so for those who don't know for those who don't know what Opsgenie is, so Opsgenie is basically an on-call incident management tool. It allows you to, route your alerts to the right person, make sure that everybody's aware of incidents that may occur, and it helps you all the way from incident awareness to incident investigation and resolution, right? So uh, and my specific role at Opsgenie is basically helping DevOps practicing teams to better their entire DevOps, flow, especially considering incident management in that DevOps pipeline.
Right.
Right.
Right. Well, so that's actually what I want to talk to you about today, is just about DevOps, because I think it's such an interesting discipline. And as teams sort of evolve and start using the cloud, it's almost like it's sort of necessary, I think, in order for you to adopt some sort of
Exactly.
a DevOps culture. And working at Atlassian, obviously Atlassian has Jira and Opsgenie and all these other services that help with software development and the software development lifecycle and things like that. But I think there's a major confusion out there about what exactly we mean by DevOps. And especially when you see companies labeling tools as like, hey, here's a DevOps tool,
Yeah.
or you've got DevOps engineers and things like that. That just seems really weird to me because I don't think of DevOps that way. And maybe we could start there, and sort of just set a baseline for the listeners here, and have you explain what exactly is DevOps, and what do we sort of mean by it as a practice or as a culture, as opposed to a set of tools or engineers?
Right. Yeah. So actually, yeah, that's it, right? Like DevOps right now, the reality is that the word DevOps has become a buzzword. Actually, quite interestingly, just I think it was yesterday or a few days ago, I saw a tweet by Patrick Debois who was saying that, just because it goes along the line, something like this, like just because an idea has become a buzzword doesn't mean that you should shy away from it. You should still go
Right.
into it and explore what it is, and you learn from it, right? And that's the problem right now, right? The industry has been capitalizing on DevOps, especially like a lot of new startups are capitalizing on DevOps, marketing themselves as DevOps tools, so much so that you know that the promise of DevOps, right, is is kind of lost or not fulfilled as
Hmm.
when you have all of these DevOps tools or DevOps engineers or DevOps certifications coming up in the industry. So let's take a step back and see let's try to understand what exactly DevOps is. So and I think the best person to who explains this or who captures this is Jez Humble. Um,
Hmm.
so he basically describes DevOps as a set of practices, a cultural mindset, not exactly a set of tools. Yes, you can have tools to help with your DevOps, your DevOps practices. I'm not saying that or any tool that says is associated with DevOps that is definitely a lie. No, it's not like that. But um, so you can have tools to help with your DevOps practices, your DevOps culture, harboring that culture in your company or in your team. But at the end of the day, it's comes down to how you and your team and your entire organization are going from the ideation phase all the way to the release to production, and then maintaining of your product, and then for example, that's where we as Opsgenie operate at, incident management. how you maintain
Right.
your product, and then like how you learn from that and then go through that loop again, right? And the idea here is that, so traditionally what we saw was that you know we had all these separate teams, where you had different roles associated to a separate stage in that in your development flow, right? So you,
Hmm.
for example, you had ideation. The first one would be ideation, where you would see more involvement of product managers and designers and sometimes engineering managers. And then you would have build, like, just talking very generally, you would have
Hmm.
build, you
Sure.
would have test, release, monitoring, incident management, feedback, and all of these were siloed. And the problem became that, you know, when when your product, when your software would go from one stage to another stage, when those involved in one stage would throw it over the wall
Right.
to those involved in the next stage, the people receiving it in the next stage, there was some communication gap, right? And what that resulted in was that things just went slower, especially when you would scale your product, and especially when things would go wrong. So, and that's what we see, right? In as an incident management tool, we see that, especially for our customers, when our customers are using Opsgenie, and the responders are not necessarily the people who were responsible for building the code, it takes them longer to resolve the incident. And
Right.
that's all that that's expected, right? You are trying to resolve something that you don't know, that you didn't build, that you don't know the nitty gritty details about, and you're trying to find what went wrong. And
Right.
that's what DevOps aims to solve, right? So I would say that, with DevOps, what you can achieve is that you can go faster, you can increase your velocity while maintaining stability. That's the
Right.
entire promise of DevOps,
Yeah,
right?
and I like that basically that quote of just because it's a buzzword doesn't mean you don't need it.
Yeah,
And I feel like the same thing has happened with serverless as well, where
yeah,
everybody just starts slapping the term serverless on their product, or say we do something with serverless, and not that it necessarily. I think it just confuses things more and more. And so when you say things like DevOps, we need a DevOps tool or we need a DevOps engineer, it sort of perverts the underlying principles, I
mm,
guess, of what you're trying to achieve. And so maybe let's go there for a second. So from a principle standpoint or a cultural philosophy, as you had said, what are sort of the main objectives here? Like, what are we trying to achieve with DevOps? Because you mentioned this idea of throwing it over the wall, and that
yeah,
happened all the time, right? Like,
yeah,
I wrote some code, I give it to my ops team, my ops team tries to put it into production. And of course, this is, and I'm going back way. I know you're actually much younger than I am,
yeah,
so good for you. But that actually I think is good because it gives you a fresh perspective on sort of seeing like how
yeah,
things should be working, as opposed to old people like me saying to ourselves like, well, we used to do it this way, so maybe we should
yeah.
keep doing it this way. But so that idea of throwing things over the wall and having something not work, and then having to just kind of kick it back, as opposed to just have a flow that this whole thing gets taken care of. So what are sort of those principles that sort of enable you to break down those walls, or break down those silos, and just kind of have your software flow all the way from ideation
Mhm.
through to production and deployment, and then to even monitoring and and troubleshooting and incident response?
Yeah. Well, actually, yeah, that's actually a very great question. Like, so, what exactly is the solution? If I said that, if we say that, okay, all those tools that are coming out, or all the certifications that are coming out aren't exactly isn't exactly the solution, then, what can we do, right, to break down those silos? So, and I look at this in, uh, I believe that there are two things that we can do. One is to try to involve everybody across that stream, right? So in mostly all the stages, right? Even as a product manager, I try my best to get involved in all the stages, because and then also, even within the ideation phase, get the technical side involved within the ideation phase. So it's not only a product PM group only. Like, get everybody on
Right.
the same table and understand how we can go from ideation to production. And that is one culture, that is one practice that you really need to incorporate in your team. Like, stop thinking about people as just fixed roles, and allow more flexibility, and allow the flow of ideas more. That one way is how we can really break down the silos. Another way is that, okay, now that you have everybody, uh, you have everybody involved in everything, the
Hmm.
responsibility also grows, right?
Right.
Now, I mean, it's almost impractical to have, a single, or a group of engineers, building everything, and also, making sure everything runs, and also maintaining the systems, and, getting everything deployed while ensuring its stability. And it becomes very difficult, right? So if we still look at traditional practices, having one team do everything would become very difficult.
Hmm.
So this is where I believe automation comes in, and automation is
Right.
key, right? And also, while we're talking about automation, we should also try to think of this left shift culture, right? So bringing everything closer to either the development team or the ops team or whoever else, but like basically bringing it closer to the build stage, right? And right now we are seeing this trend, right? We a lot of people, and including I, would say that CI/CD is kind of the backbone of DevOps, because CI/CD
Right.
is now looking at a lot of automation, right? We see a lot of automation features coming up over there, but and also not only like when you look, pardon me, when you're looking at automation, you're also looking at incident resolution, and you think that the entire incident resolution that would sit over here coming closer to your CI/CD. And eventually we're also seeing CI/CD tests and all those automated tests coming closer to the developers themselves. So you
Hmm.
see debugging and local, having all these integrations in the IDE,
Hmm.
being able to locally test your cloud apps and things like that, right? Um, yeah, and it's pretty great. Like we are seeing a left shift. We are seeing an increase in automation. So it's not only a buzzword, but even though, like, it is perceived that way, but the reality is that we are seeing these improvements happen, and we are
Right.
seeing an increase in DevOps practices and successful practices, actually.
Yeah, and I think automation is a good point because that's one of those things where sort of like automate all the things. It sounds really really good, but then it also scares people too, right? Like a lot of ops people say, "Wait a minute, if you automate away my job, then what am I supposed to do?" And the answer to that is there's a million more things that you can
Yeah.
do, especially around security, around speeding up the pipeline, about again minimizing your time to recovery, or just things that you can work on. But the idea of automation is a key principle, I think, in DevOps because it's the idea of getting things from somebody's IDE into production as quickly as possible,
Yeah.
and then being able to sort of understand how that change maybe impacted the overall system or whatever, and be
Yeah.
able to resolve those things much more quickly. I remember the days where we used to work for months on a software release, and then we would put the software release out there, and then like 80 things would be broken. And then so we would decide, all right, is it bad enough that we have to roll back the whole thing? Or is it okay where we can live with some of these bugs and then just set out the QA team to start doing some bug hunting?
Yeah.
And you don't want to do that. That's just not the way that rapid software development and modern software development works. So this idea of deploying very quickly and being able to see if there's any impact that is negative or whatever, be able to roll back those changes quickly, I think is super important. And then the
Mm.
other thing you mentioned about sort of shifting left, or this idea where the developers become more responsible for the code that they write. I think that's actually a really, really good thing where it's like, if I'm going to put a piece of code out there that is going to use too many cycles, or it's slowing things down, or it's affecting the latency, or whatever it is,
Yeah.
I need to be, I shouldn't rely on some other engineer that's running my system to say, hey, I found this problem in your code. Can you go fix it? It should
Mm.
basically be, as a team, you're saying, okay, I released this code. All right, we're noticing these high latency warnings or errors or whatever. I'm the one who is responsible for that. I should go in and I should be the one that fixes that.
Yeah. No, yeah, that's absolutely true. Like, so okay, you mentioned that, like at some point, you used to, like, you used to write code, and then you used to, like, you used to interact with the QA engineers and things like that. So in that sense, Jeremy, I have been lucky that since when I started my career, so I started my career around, like, 2018, no, not
Hmm.
that way back. So when I started my career in 2018, the first company that I joined was Tundra, actually.
Hmm.
Yeah, you've probably heard of Tundra. I believe
Absolutely.
You've
Yes.
had
Right.
Emrush down over here also talking about, serverless observability and debugging and things like that. So yeah, so I joined Tundra, and then after Tundra I joined Opsgenie, and both of these companies practice building software along the principles of DevOps. So I have never actually seen, QA engineers or, a specific team just to resolve incidents.
Right.
Like for us, it was always like, okay, you write the code, you wrote the code. If something goes wrong, you're on, and if you're on call, then or even if you're not on call, the person on call would, alert you that this, whatever you changes you made, something was wrong. So like then they would pull you in as a responder. And then I look at the our customers. Some of our customers still do have these practices. A lot of, it's especially when you're a large enterprise customer, it's a bit harder to change the entire culture,
Absolutely.
right? It's a bit slower. So when I talk to these customers and they tell me about these problems, it becomes very difficult for me to relate to them, especially because I have never I
Right.
have, yeah. But yeah, but coming back to your point about like, yeah, if you build it, you run it. And I think that's exactly what I see, serverless services or serverless offerings as a great opportunity, especially when you're new to DevOps and you're trying to look at DevOps, or you're thinking of adopting DevOps, or your team is thinking of adopting DevOps. Believe this is where serverless comes into play, right?
Hmm.
Because if you think about, like, if we go back to what I previously said about, like, okay, we don't want to try to reduce we want to try to reduce ops. We want to reduce we want to see a left shift of, you build it, you run it, so the things coming closer to the people who are building things. And we also want to see automation. This is where I believe serverless comes into play. Yeah.
Right. Right.
And it's and the reason why I say this is because, like, okay, so when I graduated from university, right, and I got my first job as a junior developer, um Tundra gave me uh, perspective of both, like, okay, so this is cloud computing, right? And I had
Right.
just graduated, and I had seen, okay, this is cloud computing now. Okay, I'd always heard about it in university, right? In university, you hear about the latest trends and things like that. Okay, so, oh my God, I'll get to work on AWS. I had never written any, I had never interacted with any AWS service before. And I was presented containers, EC2 containers, and I was presented AWS Lambda. And with AWS Lambda, I just, got to it, wrote my first, lines of code, got it in, uploaded it, and, and I was able to trigger the Lambda function. With EC2, I spent quite a while trying to understand, getting over that learning curve to a
Right.
point where I was like, like, oh my God, if I don't get it done by this week, I'll probably be fired. Like, I need to,
Well, it's funny. It's funny though that you mentioned the idea of where serverless fits in DevOps, because I totally agree with you here. And I'll give you a history lesson. And so I hope I don't sound like an old man yelling at clouds. But
no, no,
essentially, how it used to be was that you would need to maintain a server somewhere, and usually it was a physical server that, we weren't even talking about VMs and things like that. It was a physical server, and there was networking, and there's all these other things you had to do with it. And that was something where there was a clear line between someone who was a developer and was writing code, to between someone who was actually installing software patches and
yeah,
doing the networking and actually plugging in cables in a data center somewhere. So a lot of that changed, sort of in the late aughts, 2008, 2009, when EC2 started to become more popular with AWS and so forth. And that made it a little bit easier, but you were still thinking about VPCs and trying to do networking
yeah,
and that kind of stuff. And that was still, it was easier, but still something that you wanted someone to set up for you so that as a developer, I would just have an environment that I could use.
mhm,
What serverless has changed is that now you just have an environment, right? And so
yeah,
you don't have to set up an environment. You just need an AWS account or a Google, cloud account or IBM or whatever,
yeah,
that you can just go and just upload some code and have it immediately execute within that environment. And so that's one of the things for me where if you try to say to a developer, hey, I need you to take responsibility for all of this stuff. And oh, by the way, we're running on EC2 instances and
yeah,
VPCs, and you need to know the security groups and you need to understand how
exactly.
all of these things might be able to affect you. That is too much, in my opinion, to ask somebody.
Yes.
But to say, look, and you're throwing your code into, even if it's a container in Fargate or something like that, or you're doing a Lambda function, That's pretty isolated environment. It's pretty easy for you to reason about if something's not working. I'm not able to connect to a service. It's running too slow. It's timing out. Like things that are easy, I think, for you to understand and debug. And that just becomes so. I don't think that's too much of an ask. So I do think that you're asking developers now to go all the way through that spectrum and to understand a little bit of the operational aspect of it, but they don't have to understand the deep networking stuff or how packets are routed and some of that stuff. They just need to understand some of the basic cloud principles. So I think serverless enables that and really is this huge enabler of companies accepting DevOps.
Yeah, exactly. Like, that whole point about a lot of the underlying infrastructure being abstracted away to the cloud vendor and becoming the responsibility of the cloud vendor, that in itself is, just extremely helpful to, anybody trying to practice DevOps, any team trying to practice DevOps, because all of a sudden, like, you no longer have to worry about, your ENIs or your security groups, as you mentioned. All of that is managed by the cloud vendor that you're using, whether it be AWS or Google cloud provider. And what that allows you to do is, like, as we have seen quite a bit, like, as one of the well-known benefits of serverless is it actually allows you to focus on your business logic more, right?
Right.
And it allows you to not only allows you to focus on your business logic, but another underlying, another hidden gem, I would say, is that it also allows you to connect and communicate, focus on the communication and sharing of code, and getting over that learning curve of when other teams are involved, right? So even though you didn't write the code yourself, if you look at somebody else's Lambda functions, you can focus on, or if you look at somebody else's, fast functions, or Lambdas,
Mhm.
let's say, you can it's easier to understand, right? Like, so it's easier to collaborate on, on a code base. And on top of that, it just basically it just makes it, you know easier for an entire team going through that spectrum, to manage that pipeline, that DevOps pipeline, going from ideation to thing. In fact, I say that, especially uh, as as a product manager, I would say that all product managers should also learn how to deploy Lambda functions, especially when you're trying to ideate through an idea, right?
Right.
Because it's become so easy. You can write throwaway code. It becomes very easy to write. You just write throwaway code, just code that works, just to test whether an idea works or not, and especially when you're trying to find that perfect product market fit. You just write a bunch of Lambda functions with your engineering manager or your lead engineer, and show that to the test group of customers, see if it works, go back and ideate it. And it's so easy to do that because, one, Lambda serverless functions are cheap, or serverless services are cheap. They're the pay as you go model.
Right.
They're very lightweight. They're very easy to get up and running with. You don't need to worry about all that infrastructure that we already talked about. um, so even there, just in the ideation phase, it's very easy to go forward.
Hi, everyone. I want to take a minute to thank our sponsor, Epsagon. Epsagon enables teams to instantly simplify, visualize, and understand what's happening with their complex microservice architectures. With their comprehensive, lightweight auto instrumentation, users are able to eliminate the gaps in data and manual work associated with other APM solutions, providing significant reduction in issue detection, troubleshooting, and resolution times. Epsagon aggregates and correlates data from all the third-party tools you love, delivering a single pane of glass for understanding serverless, containers, Kubernetes, and more. Engineers now know when something is wrong and can immediately trace issues to root cause before they affect production, increase development efficiency, and reduce application downtime with Epsagon. As a special for Serverless Chats listeners, if you try out Epsagon and connect your first trace today, they'll hook you up with one of their awesome t-shirts. Check it out at epsagon.com/serverlesschats. I think there are a lot of benefits to just using serverless to do some of these DevOps practices. And I know we haven't really mentioned all of the principles, I guess. I mean, we mentioned a couple of the main ones,
Yeah.
but I think one of the things, or a part of the DevOps culture, or at least a part of the what you need to do to fully embrace it, is this idea of building microservices, right? Because I mean,
Yeah.
microservices allow individual teams or small groups of people to work on parts of the application independently. And when you start dealing with some massive monolith and you've got a bunch of different teams all contributing to the same code
Yeah,
base, it gets really, really messy. So being able to
exactly.
break those up into smaller things is super important. So serverless, I think, has a bunch of really cool things baked in, especially with like intercommunication between microservices. And you don't have to
Yeah,
set up things like Kafka or RabbitMQ or some of these other things that is just
true.
another thing to manage. So what are your thoughts on that? Like, what are some of the tools or the services available as part of
Yeah,
the serverless ecosystem that just help with microservices?
right. So, I mean, as you mentioned, like, microservices, we're all familiar with the benefits of microservices, right?
I
And
hope we are.
hopefully, right? Like, uh, believe me, like, I have dealt with monoliths, especially like, when you look at front end is a monolith. In the many cases, front end can be considered a monolith. You have
Mhm.
this one big front end code base, and like it just becomes very difficult. So yeah, and you really do see the benefits of microservices, and it's actually microservices, the idea of microservices that really plays well with the entire DevOps culture and practice, right? Where you can have each team working on something, you can go fast on that, and especially when you look at the stability. I know we're going off on a tangent over here, and we haven't started talking about how serverless is baked into the benefits of building microservices. But I just wanted to mention that one point that is really amazing that that I have seen when dealing with monoliths and microservices, that is that when you're looking at it from a DevOps perspective, and you're looking at stability of your system,
Mhm.
just having one part break, and not affecting the other parts, that in itself, I believe is taken granted for, right?
Right.
It's pretty amazing, right? Like being able to decouple uh, all these different aspects or all these components of your entire system, and looking at them individually, where one component's failure does not necessarily result to another component's failure. That in itself is pretty amazing with microservices. However, what that does lead to is that when you're thinking of microservice architectures, then you also need to think about the communication overhead, as you mentioned, right?
Right.
So you need, yes, you did decouple all of these, but now you still need all of these to communicate with one another, right?
And
And I believe,
reliably.
and reliably, yes, exactly, reliably, without, right? And then, as you mentioned, there's a lot of overhead over there. I personally haven't dealt with Kafka or RabbitMQ, uh,
Consider yourself
but
lucky.
yeah, thank you. Yeah, but like, I we saw Event Bridge, uh, you know, and I believe, and I think a lot of people would agree with me over here, that Event Bridge is definitely the next best thing after AWS ramped up,
Mhm.
right? Um, and that's because of like all the use cases that it has enabled, and how powerful of a tool, of a service it is, right? Right. Uh, and it really allows you to think and about serverless architectures and event-driven architectures in a whole new from a whole new perspective, right? uh, One of the best things that it allows you to do is like reduce all those ops that you would that you would otherwise have to deal with, such a and all that overhead with communication. Or one of the things, like even marshaling and demarshaling, you're
Right.
just sending um, you know you're literally just communicating in the form of events, where and both and being able to leverage other capabilities of event bridge, such as routing of events based on rules. That in itself also just enables a lot of use cases in within your microservice architecture, and also as ancillary services supporting your DevOps pipelines, right?
Right.
So yes, one is definitely Event Bridge. Another service that I would, and again, like when we're mentioning all of these services, it's also good to point out, that age-old myth about serverless equating to only Lambda functions, right?
Mm.
So a lot of people, especially even I, right, when I began looking at, okay, what is this word serverless? I started thinking, okay, yeah, it's serverless equals Lambda functions. Then I realized, no, it's actually a whole set of tools. It's a whole set of services that are available out there. And like, so we mentioned Event Bridge. We should also give credit to DynamoDB.
Right.
Where, okay, yes, you have uh, you know especially when you're looking at it from the point of scalability, you can have your entire microservice architecture built using serverless services. But if your data layer isn't scalable, then what's the point,
And what's the point,
right?
right?
Exactly. So having that incorporated also, and then also having a lot of the responsibility being abstracted away to the cloud vendor, that in itself allows a lot of teams trying to adopt DevOps to go faster, right?
Right.
So especially when you're looking at at EventBridge, DynamoDBs, then of course you have your AWS Lambda functions, your Fargate, your basically your containers as a service. If you find FAS services a bit limiting, you can always look at containers as a service. Um, and we are seeing a rise in popularity with containers as a service. So you have this whole set of tools in your in your cupboard that you can just basically bring in, plug and play, and that's what serverless allows you to do, right? It literally lets you bring in the service and lets you plug it in and play it in your entire in the entire way your microservice architecture operates,
Right. Yeah,
right?
and I think you bring up a point too. Like you mentioned DynamoDB, which has global tables and all kinds of things that allow
Exactly.
you to to replicate data to other regions. The other thing that's cool about DynamoDB or EventBridge or Lambda functions is that it runs in multiple availability zones, even if you're running it in a single region, and that gives you redundancy and resiliency and all these backups that and again, speaking of Kafka or RabbitMQ or something like that, where you'd have to have multiple services or multiple systems running in multiple regions or multiple availability zones that were subscribing to all these events and trying to manage all of that complexity. EventBridge just kind of does that for you, right? You don't even have to think about it. Same thing with DynamoDB. But DynamoDB global tables actually is something where this could get us to maybe not an easy way to get to it, but certainly possible to start thinking about active regions, right? Where you could
Exactly.
actually have your systems running in Europe and you have them running in the US and maybe you have them running in, maybe in Australia or something like that. So what are your
Yeah.
thoughts on that and where serverless helps get teams to deliver, not only deliver software faster, but to
Mm.
deliver software to more places or more regionally?
Right. I think, like if we take a step back and if we look at, you mentioned active. So yes, active architectures in itself is a whole different topic, right? And you have, one of the great, personalities in this field, Adrian Hornsby, who talks
Absolutely.
about this quite well. And, and he has a great set of resources, blogs, and talks about that. And, anybody who's interested and wants to learn anything about active, they can definitely go and refer to that. But if you look at that architecture from a DevOps point of view, from the fact that what do we actually want to achieve with this type of architecture, right? And you trace back a lot of its motivation and its origins, not origins per se, because it's been there in academia for quite a while now, but a lot of the motivation to adopt such an architecture, a lot of it comes from the fact that that one horrific story of the Netflix outage,
Right.
right? And I just want to mention, like, as a side note, like, we've been talking about this Netflix outage for quite a while. I'm just waiting for the next, big outage, because I think we need, we've been overusing this Netflix outage story
Right.
quite a bit now, right? Working in an incident management tool in an incident management company, we do hear a lot about a lot of outages, but none of them compared to what we saw with Netflix, or on that scale. But regardless, so we see a lot of that motivation for active coming from the outage of Netflix, and we saw Netflix kind of start pushing, or the idea of resilient architectures. Not saying that it wasn't there before. Like, of course it was, but
Right.
like, we saw Netflix, one of the big tech companies, starting to push and really think about it from a whole new perspective. And the whole point over here is to maintain stability, right? So, and that again is one of the, as we mentioned in the earlier, that actually is one of the goals of DevOps, right? And now, when you're thinking about active, right, it's easier said than done, right?
That's very
And
true.
right, like, it's easy. It's actually easier said than done. But like, when you start thinking of how serverless, tools can come in and help with setting up such an architecture, we do see a lot of burden lifted off. So, for example, you mentioned DynamoDB, global tables. Then there's also Route 53. So we have
Right.
geo routing that they recently uh, announced. I believe it's one of the more recent capabilities with Route 53. We have DNS failover with Route 53. Then you have API gateway, which came up with custom domains, which allows you to target now regional endpoints. So you can see like we can actually build this entire active service with serverless services, where a lot of that responsibility again gets abstracted away to the uh, you know, cloud vendor. And I know I've said this, statement, being abstracted away to the cloud vendor quite a bit. And it's simply because I want to stress on the fact of how important it is to try to reduce the ops to eventually move towards a very successful DevOps practicing team, right? And again, having a lot of these, activities, let's say, being automated by these managed or, services as especially when it comes to scalability. And again, like we talk about serverless uh, in the sense that a lot of times when you talk about the limitations of serverless, you look at it. One of them is that it's stateless, right? So
Right.
a lot of people have difficulties in thinking about stateless, uh, how to think of like a stateless whole business logic, and how would you have your business logic translated to a stateless architecture. But with active it actually becomes an advantage, right, to have stateless architectures, to have stateless compute services, right? Because you don't want to hold the state in too long in an active, and you want to keep on switching between nodes. And another thing is also, you know another benefit where serverless really really shines is the fact that it's pay as you go, the pay as you go model.
Hmm.
So if you have nodes that aren't being used, why pay for them,
Right.
right? So that's another advantage where you can see the benefits of serverless come into play. Now there's that, and there's also the scalability. So all of a sudden you have a lot of traffic being routed to a specific node. You may not you may not have handled your routing rules very well considering your traffic or things like that. But it's okay, your DynamoDB is going to scale. If you have, let's say, a Lambda function over there, or maybe a Fargate instance, it will scale, right? So auto scaling, pay as you go, and statelessness, all of these come together to really help you build that active architecture, and start thinking of how you can build that active architecture. Now, by the way, another thing I want to mention, which I think we missed upon, was when we're talking about like the characteristics of serverless function or serverless in general,
Hmm.
and how we're using and how we are using these serverless functions or serverless tools to build microservices. One of the characteristics is that when you're thinking of a serverless architecture, it's event driven, right?
Right.
And that plays very well when you're dealing with microservices, right? All of a sudden you now have to start thinking about event driven architectures. We're coming back to Event Bridge, and where your Event Bridge may be triggering a lot of your um, Fargate instances or Lambda functions, and having you know just having that constraint of uh, having functions or having your compute resources being triggered by events allows you to uh, make sure that you think about this architecture in an event driven fashion, right? There is a possibility, though, and like I must point this out, that there is a possibility for you to fall into an anti-pattern where especially when you're trying to adopt serverless, and you're moving to this granular architecture, you're moving to serverless architecture, microservices from your monolith. It is easy, like to fall into an anti-pattern where you try to replicate your entire logic, your entire business logic on monolith exactly into your serverless architecture, where you would
Right.
have one lambda sitting before another lambda function, which sits before another lambda function. All of a sudden you have this anti-pattern, because where you
Right.
can't do things asynchronously, right? And asynchronity is something that is again another benefit of having lambda functions, or just thinking about microservices, right?
Yeah.
So there is this anti-pattern you can you may fall into, but as long as you think about it as in an event-driven fashion, as long as you know what you're doing, as long as you do your research before building this architecture, you should be good.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no, and I think that anti-pattern is very prevalent, where people just end up, unfortunately, trying to stack too much logic or try to chain functions together in a way that is definitely
Mhm.
slower. But so we talked a lot about the benefits, I think, from a DevOps perspective or from a DevOps culture, of building things with serverless, and I think that makes a lot of sense. But what about, there's still ops work to be done, right? Like we still
Yeah.
have to clean up development environments or maybe run some audits or some of these other things. So I guess from that perspective of, and maybe this falls more on operations, but I think it's sort of part of the full cycle, right?
Yeah.
Where does serverless fit in there, and what are some of the tools that are available for you to sort of, just kind of run the infrastructure, beyond just trying to, beyond just trying to, deploy code that is, maybe client facing.
Yeah. Yeah, actually, this is a pretty great question because when I look at serverless and how serverless can aid in DevOps practices, so like we talked about like in, serverless functions and serverless technologies inside the main uh, you know inside your main code base, inside your main infrastructure itself. But yes, then there's a whole set of other use cases that we can come to where your serverless functions, the serverless technologies can act as ancillaries, um, you know, uh, helper functions or ancillary services, aiding you through that, aiding you to get through that DevOps pipeline, right? So as you mentioned, right, cleaning up your environments or even just thinking about deployments, how we're looking at automated deployments is throughout the CI/CD, throughout the CI/CD stage, and also automated tests, and then again like monitoring and uh, debugging and identifying root causes of incidents and remediation and all of that. All of that can actually be done with serverless functions. And the the thing is that there are a lot of tools out there that are trying to help you achieve these things. You know, um, like Atlassian itself is building a lot of tools that
Mhm.
helps you achieve this, helps you automate through this. But having those tools and having those third-party tools and having serverless technologies integrated with those tools really does give you that extra boost to go faster while maintaining the stability that we're always talking about, that we're really trying to go for. So I can give you an example.
Absolutely.
So there are actually many examples that we can talk over that I would actually like to point out. But one of the examples that I really like is, for example, we recently, actually not recently, about a year ago or so, we built an integration with EventBridge, and basically the use cases were such that the way we saw customers using our the Opsgenie EventBridge integration was, and okay, they get an alert from either Datadog or New Relic about some form of configuration drift, right,
Right.
in their architecture, in their infrastructure, pardon me. And once they identify this infrastructure drift in their AWS setup, you know Opsgenie would send you an alert, and that alert acts as a trigger through EventBridge into your um, AWS infrastructure that can run automated playbooks to correct that configuration drift,
Hmm.
right? And I think that was just an amazing use case that we saw some of our customers using. Another thing was, like for example, like security compliance, or like when you see some uh, suspicious activity
Right.
in your account through, you can use AWS CloudTrail, or you can use any other security monitoring or audit logging tool. You integrate that with, again, Opsgenie gets that alert, and it upon that alert, using, again, this is where I've seen customers leverage the event routing capability of EventBridge. Depending on what the content of the alert is, they route it to the right area of their infrastructure to immediately remediate that. All of this being done automatically.
Right.
So what we're actually seeing is a kind of a reduction in the need for SRE teams, the need for infrastructure maintenance team, basically all of ops, right? Like, so developers themselves can set this up, right? Because it's so easy. A lot of it's so easy to get up and running with Event Bridge and Lambda functions or serverless in general that you can have your development teams set this up and take responsibility of that ops part also,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And I know that I think in the beginning you mentioned like, sometimes ops can get scared, like, oh, what's the point? What are we needed for? But like, why not? Like you come, let's come together. That's the whole point, right? Of coming together and like helping if the development team can't set it up, then that's where I feel that we need to start thinking of ops in a whole different way, of especially with the advent of serverless and all of these third-party tools. We need to start thinking of ops in a whole different way of best uh, how we can leverage this new technology in the best way possible to accelerate according to the team's development practices, according to the team's cultural practices in building software, right? Because again, every team is different, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's why that's also a reason why I you can't really say that there's one solution or one tool that fits it all, all
Right.
the that will solve all the DevOps problems of the industry. No, like every team is different. Not only like every team is different within an organization, every organization is different, right?
Right. Yeah.
So but regardless, so you can have like third-party tools to try to help you bolster your DevOps solutions, but as soon as you see that okay, it's not working, that's where you can uh, fill in the gaps with serverless services,
Yeah.
right? And I think that in itself is just pretty amazing, right? Um, like we're looking at customers do this with Opsgenie. We're seeing a lot of automation come up. Um, in Opsgenie itself, for example, we're using Lambda functions to replicate customer traffic. So you have synthetic monitoring Lambda
Right.
functions, right? And you have
Right.
transactional monitoring Lambda functions. So these synthetic monitoring functions, they're hitting our APIs. Then the transactional monitoring Lambda functions are receiving that input and processing it, and sending it to New Relic or and the other monitoring tools that we're using. And whenever something is wrong, that Lambda function will automatically send an alert to Opsgenie, and we will, surprise, we use Opsgenie ourselves internally. So we get an alert, and then it's amazing. So this way we manage to track, or we manage to catch errors or incidents before our customers can even get it, right? Because
Right.
and remember, like, this is again where you can leverage the characteristics of serverless uh, services or tools, because again it's pretty easy to set up, so developers can set this up, right? So the developers actually, I remember going around and playing with a few monitoring Lambda functions myself when I was a developer. So I set it up, and then, like, getting that connected to New Relic and doing the whole so again, we try to practice, play by that motto, you build, you run it, as much
Yeah.
as possible. So for example, when something goes wrong, obviously we get that alert, and we try to investigate it ourselves. So that all of that is made possible because at some point we are using Lambda functions to send a lot of monitoring data, and generate a lot of data and send that monitoring data over to New Relic.
Yeah, and I
Yeah.
think you hit the nail on the head in terms of where the SRE team members go after after some things become easier. And you mentioned this idea of like CI/CD pipelines. So if it's super easy to set up a CI/CD pipeline and it's just a matter of a couple of clicks in a dashboard, or it's just you have to deploy maybe another
Mm,
CloudFormation template or something. If
mm,
I was an SRE, which I've done roles similar to SRE in the past,
okay.
I would be really, really tired of setting up another CI/CD pipeline for somebody. Like if that was my job, just we got to set up another one of these, set up another one of these. That
Yeah.
is just wasted human capital where you could be spending that time, like you said, writing a Lambda function that sends synthetic traffic, or
Yeah.
getting into chaos engineering, right? So I mean,
Yes.
if you have people who are know the ops side of things and can say, hey, what happens if this service can no longer communicate with that service? how does your service react, how does the other service recover, and so forth. And again, becoming chaos engineers around that, I think, is a hugely important thing that larger teams have got to start doing, maybe even smaller teams. But you've got to
Right.
start doing to understand, the nature of distributed systems and what happens when one thing breaks down. So
Yeah.
I do think that there's an evolution here where it's like the more you can automate, the more sort of your developers can own some of that stack. It just frees up people to do more important work than things that
Mhm.
can just easily be automated.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I definitely agree with you. Like once you have a lot of automation, again, like, we get back to the same point, where like you have automation, you can start thinking of the business logic. You can start thinking about how you want your company to perform, to scale, and basically work for your customers, right? And I like SRE. The now when we look at SRE, we see SRE is now free to start, you know, basically looking at the resiliency of the system, right?
Right.
Performing more tests, making sure that we are at the amount of nines that we want in terms of resiliency and availability,
Right.
right? And SRE gets freed up because of that, right? And like also when you were talking about automation and you mentioned CI/CD, I wanted to sidetrack to this, the concept, this up and coming concept of GitOps. So we have heard of, quite a bit of it recently. There's a company, Weave Works, I believe they're really pushing the needle on this. They're looking at this quite a bit. Uh, but like even that, right? Like when we think about automation, so a lot of that automation can, when you're managing your, and this entire idea of GitOps is kind of the motivation comes behind like the rise of Kubernetes, like
Right.
kind of Kubernetes is becoming popular, and like how you would um, you know uh, s- you know manage your Kubernetes infrastructure, and they're looking at the property of Kubernetes to kind of it's because it's a defined architecture, like um, I forgot the term, so I'm so sorry. Like,
It's fine.
yeah, you define it in your kubectl file with kubectl and everything, and like,
Right.
and you would push that, you'd push the change, the infrastructure changes or your code changes. That's when GitOps would, basically automate. You'd go from continuous delivery to continuous deployment. It's a push from continuous delivery to continuous deployment. But I whenever I look at continuous deployment, and so whenever I look at GitOps in general, like I find it very scary because okay, you pushed something,
Right.
right? And all of a sudden, all of these things are happening automatically, right? Your entire infrastructure is just about to change. Your entire code base is about to change, and you didn't have like, it's always very nice, right, to have somebody in the middle in a staging environment. You first push it to a staging
Right.
environment,
And you can
somebody in the
test it.
middle,
Right. Yeah. Exactly.
you test it
Yeah.
exactly, and then there's a little button that says okay, you deploy, and then it goes to production. Everything's cool, but you're reducing that, right? And at the end of the day, that's what the idea of DevOps is, to try to reduce the manual labor and push for automation.
Right.
But then I look at GitOps and I'm like, did we just like go go crazy, like like are we going too far? But then that's where I see, okay, you can have, GitOps shouldn't only be thought about in the terms of okay, like yeah, automating your deployment, but you should also think of it from a perspective of observability. And again, when we're talking about observability, that's where I believe we can leverage these Lambda functions, because one, your Lambda functions are very light and they're just being used for monitoring, right? So you're continuously monitoring the actual state as compared to the desired state, right?
Right.
And whenever you see the actual state has drifted away from the desired state, again, you can, you can either use Opsgenie as your alert consolidation tool, or you can, just trigger an event through event bridge from your Lambda function, send an event through event bridge, and again go and remediate that, or uh, yeah, yeah, basically just go and remediate uh, that drift away from the desired state.
Right.
So this is one way, right? So we are looking at automation, right? And we are trying to find ways to go faster and faster. And this happens that okay, as we go faster, we still need to remember maintain stability, maintain availability,
Right.
and this is where where we see the benefit of especially Lambda functions or Azure functions, or whatever type of form of fast functions you're using, because um, when we talk about using these using fast functions in production for your actual code base, there are a lot of limitations that everybody talks about, a lot of edge cases that aren't covered by these services. But in this case, in this regard, it fits perfectly because, one, it's cost effective, it's easy to spin up and use, it's scalable, right? So if you want, like at Opsgenie, like when we want to increase the traffic on a certain API, simply have several concurrent Lambda functions just bombarding that API with requests and different kinds of requests, right? It's scalable,
Right.
you know, it's easy to spin up. And I see this is exactly where one of the benefits lies, right? But yeah, you do have some limit. But again, yeah, as I mentioned, like in production, you may have some limitations. So when you're thinking about it in terms of microservices and active-active architecture, as we talked about before, but when you're thinking about it as ancillary services and just helping you go through that DevOps um, pipeline, you it's, when you're thinking of it as glue code, especially glue code, it's really beneficial to use serverless functions.
Yeah. Well, I think all that ties together too. And I mean, GitOps is something that just CI/CD, continuous deployment is one of those things where yes, it scares a lot of people because it's just going through fast, and you're, but
Yeah,
it allows you to move so quickly and make changes so quickly. And I think that if you embrace the whole culture, if you embrace the idea of microservices and serverless, deploying very small units of code, and
exactly.
just this idea of test-driven development, or being able to have the tests that you need in there and so forth, the ability for you to roll back quickly, adding in things like chaos engineering to know what happens if we put something out there and it breaks, that we know that the other things will degrade gracefully. Having that
Mm,
capability and kind of following that whole thing, I mean, that's sort of the holy grail of doing this stuff, because it's okay if you break something sometimes, but
yeah.
it should go through a test process, and there should be a development environment where you're testing these things against other things. But if something does break, you're isolating it, you're minimizing, you're creating those bulkheads there that are minimizing the impact that it has on a larger scale. So we're running out of time, and so before we finish, though, I do want to talk about. I mean, we've been talking a lot about serverless and Event Bridge and Active Active and DynamoDB and all these great things, but there, it's not like a team can just go ahead and shift tomorrow and
Huh,
start using all this stuff, right? Like there are a number of barriers to adoption, some of those being just the cultural change in a company, first of all,
yeah,
but also just this idea of the learning of these tools, and then maybe even the limitation of some of these tools. So what are
yeah,
your thoughts on some of the barriers that might
yeah,
exist to people who want to adopt not only DevOps, but maybe DevOps, with serverless?
yeah. Well, actually, I think this is I can best answer this with a story of mine, like or something that I experienced was especially when I switched over to Opsgenie from Tundra. So, like, remember, I was in Tundra, serverless. That time Thunder was a serverless monitoring tool. Now it's become much more, of course. But that time, we were focused on serverless, and I was just like, oh my God, this is an amazing technology. Then I switched over to Opsgenie, and I see, okay, we aren't using it that much. And in fact, there was when I switched over to it, a major service, a major functionality of ours that was initially being built on serverless architecture. The senior engineers rolled back on the decision and went back to EC2 and other forms of container services. And I asked, well, why did this happen? I didn't have that much experience, and I really wanted to know what happened. So I remember one of the co-founders actually sat me down. He he was a pretty cool guy. He actually took me to a whole different meeting room, and he sat me down like, okay, I'm going to teach you something now. I'm like, okay. So he told me that the service is great, and it is definitely in some way the future, but in its current state, we do see a lot of issues. And this was back in late 2018,
Mhm.
right? Let's say. So that time, around that time, they didn't even the the maximum runtime was 5 minutes, I
Five
believe, for a
minutes,
Lambda
yes. Yep.
function. Yeah. And then we saw it was in that same year or a bit later that we saw 15 minutes then. So that is a huge improvement, I would say. But like at that time, we weren't ready, or we weren't ready. Our use case was not the best use case, or the way we were looking at our use case was not in the best manner to adopt serverless. And I think it's very important to understand this, to understand the limitations and what you can and cannot build, and how you can get around these barriers. Because I feel that there's always a way to get around these barriers. Um, are you just willing to invest in it, right? And it's and so we it's not like Opsgenie, gave up on serverless. We continued. We still use a lot of serverless components in a lot of our in a lot of areas in Opsgenie, especially in our DevOps pipeline. For example, when we want to spin up emergency instances, we use Fargate, or we were using Fargate. I'm not sure if we are still. We're using Fargate for our SRE, logging and other operations, because it's easy to spin up and it's cost effective for that use case. But there are definitely limitations, but what I have noticed, Jeremy, like even in that small period from 2018 since I graduated to now, I've seen, and we have all seen,
Right.
major leaps of improvement, right? From going just mentioning 5 minutes to 15 minutes runtime. That was a major improvement. We were talking, I remember there was this whole conversation that I had with Emir Shamdan, and how we were looking at, okay, we need to think about cost, runaway cost, right? And we now see that the billing has become more granular for a lot of serverless services. For example, Lambda functions, it was 100 millisecond, now it's 1 millisecond.
Right.
So that in itself is just a huge improvement. I think we see the same thing definitely for a lot of serverless services. And then there are other things, like for example, being able to debug, right? Being able to debug your serverless infrastructure. That in itself is problematic, right? But we do see a lot of improvements in the industry, for example, and also a lot of third-party tools are coming up. So, for example, I've been following Thunder's growth as they went from, uh, as they kind of started encapsulating all of, enabling cloud developers. And recently they came up with Thunder Sidekick, which is, I think, a very cool feature. And if if people haven't, if people haven't seen that, I recommend they go check it out. And we're definitely looking at it. But yeah, and we see a lot of and this whole community that's coming up to fill in those gaps. And there's still a long way to go, but I still feel that even what we have right now is pretty amazing.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I think that there are limitations, and serverless is not a silver bullet, right? Like you're going to run into
Yeah.
limitations, but I do see. I mean, I would recommend to anybody, if you're trying to establish a really good DevOps practice within your organization, or you're just building applications, the services that are serverless and have those serverless qualities are going to be the ones that make the most sense for you to choose, if you can. If you can't, then don't. But if you can, choose those, because that just gives you all of those benefits we've been talking about through this entire episode, and just that ability for you to really own your code, get those CI/CD pipelines to the point where you're delivering multiple multiple releases per day, and things like that. So Sarjeel, listen, thank you so much for joining me and spending this time and sharing your knowledge on DevOps and serverless. If people want to get a hold of you, or find out more stuff that you're working on, how do they do that?
Well, yeah, I'm a pretty open guy. You can just contact me with whatever channel you find. Twitter is great. So Jeremy, I think you are
I will
including,
yes, I'll put the stuff in the show notes. Yeah.
Yeah, you can contact me through Twitter or on my email. You can find my email on my website, which I think is also going to be in the show notes.
Yep, sarjeelyusuf.me, right?
Yeah,
Perfect.
exactly. And so you can contact me through my Gmail or like Twitter anyway. And I would just love to talk to anybody who, and as you said, as you realized, Jeremy, I'm also pretty new to this field. And there's a lot of learning that I need to do and I want to do. And so I would really love for people to reach out, and I would really love to reach out to people and just brainstorm a whole bunch of ideas, and especially use cases, because I think it's the use cases that are really driving all of these improvements in serverless.
I totally agree.
Yeah.
Listen, fresh blood and new ideas, new perspectives are always good things. So also, if people want to check out Ops Genie, opsgenie.com. But otherwise, we'll put all the stuff in the show notes. Thanks again, Sarjeel.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. Thank you so much for having me.
And that's this week's Serverless Chat. I want to give a huge thank you to Sarjeel Yusuf for being my guest this week, and to our sponsor, Epsagon. If you want to check out the show notes and a full transcript of this episode, you can find them at serverlesschats.com/89. For more Serverless Chat, subscribe, sign up to be an insider, check us out on YouTube, and follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. You can connect with me on Twitter at Jeremy_Daily. And if you want to keep up to date on everything serverless, make sure you subscribe to the Off by None newsletter at offbynone.io. Thank you so much for joining me, and I look forward to chatting with all of you again next week.